How you guys? Whoa! I'm gonna blow everybody away with this microphone. How you guys all doing tonight?
Okay.
That was pathetic. How you guys all doing tonight? I know we're talking about the IRS, but we can have a little bit more enthusiasm. So, my name's Dan Johnson. As Jeff mentioned, I am the executive director of the Tax Revolution Institute. We launched on President's Day or so, and we have been all around the country at left conferences, at right conferences, talking about not only the need with the audit to understand how the IRS actually works. Most people can't tell you how many people work at the IRS. Most people can't tell you what kind of information the IRS requests and can request from a taxpayer. Most IRS agents can't even understand the code themselves. And so not only with the audit, understanding the IRS and understanding where we are before we know where to go, but also focusing in a very particular area. Look, the IRS has one job, it's to collect taxes. Or they had one job at one point. The IRS's job was to collect taxes, period, end of story. You do what Congress tells you to do, you stay within the law, you collect taxes. Over the past few years, politicians have realized that the IRS is so feared that if you start throwing a few other things their way, they'll make sure it gets enforced. So Obamacare is now under the IRS's jurisdiction. The IRS knows nothing about healthcare. They know nothing about medicine, yet they're now running the Obamacare operation. The IRS, we actually went to a public forum. It was in March. And the IRS building, by the way, they hold their public forums in their headquarters. And in their headquarters, you go through less security at an airport and in Congress than getting into the IRS building. Not only did you have to wear an escort badge, but you were patted down and you had to have an escort to go to the bathroom. You had to sign in twice, give them your ID. It was a ridiculous concept that any citizen would ever show up at these public forums. So they're just for show. Well, we show up. And we're listening to these various Irish officials talk, and one of the officials at one point says, you know, we really should change our mission at the IRS. Now, this should have been shock and awe for most citizens listening to this. There were all of two people in the room listening to that. But for the citizens who got a chance to listen to this, and we have the full recording on our website, Ford does a great job videoing them. By the way, Ford Fisher back there, needs to give him a round of applause. He's videotaping tonight. And he's your man on the hill paying attention to what the IRS and what Congress are doing with taxes. So anyway, so we're at this public forum, and the official goes, well, yeah, we should change our mission. And the other panelists kind of look at him and, well, why? Well, we really believe that the IRS is now not just a tax collector, but a benefits administrator.
Oh.
And so the IRS has been continually given these areas where it doesn't belong. They have no expertise in, and it's given the areas simply because either Congress sets it up that way, or Congress sets it up that way with the intention that because people fear the IRS, when you get that letter, you get that symbol on your letter, because people fear the IRS, that Congress is okay with giving them jurisdiction over a law that nobody likes. So there was a regulation put forth by the IRS after the Tea Party targeting, and I don't call it a scandal. And there's a reason I don't call it a scandal. Most of you may not know that there are two court cases right now working their way through filed by the Tea Parties. And in one of those court cases recently, the appeals court told the IRS, there are 3 groups on here still waiting for their nonprofit status. You need to get them into the system. And the IRS goes, well, because they sued us, we weren't going to put them in the system. And they're now at the back of the line, so they're going to wait another 4 to 6 months to get their nonprofit status. So it's not over. And no congressman, actually, Jeff kind of briefly mentioned this, we've brought that up to several congressmen, and no congressman has ever challenged us and said, oh yeah, it's over. No one on the Hill has done that. So during the IRS abuse, toward the end of 2013, the IRS released a regulation, and what they called it was they were going to draw a bright line between what a nonprofit group could and could not do politically. It was introduced in November 2013, and the Congress passed protections against it that expire at the end of every year, because we can't get Congress to do anything permanently. So they're going to pass protections that expire at the end of every year, and eventually they're going to be out of office and they're not going to care about it that much. But those protections, the reason I'm speaking to you today about this, and one of the reasons we flipped, is because those protections expire at the end of this month. So I'm bringing this issue to your attention right now. What these provisions do is they basically completely eliminate accountability for government from organizations. They prevent organizations from even using the name of a politician in any of their communications to the public. So if you're an organization, you can say politician so-and-so, or you can't say politician so-and-so. You can say this law was introduced, but you can't say by who. You can say this law was failed or defeated, or it passed, but you can't say who voted for or against it as an organization. And the IRS is starting with one category of organizations with the intention of applying it to every single organization. Now, in order to understand this rule, though, we have to dig a little bit into my favorite place to be, which is the Internal Revenue Code. That was a joke, by the way. So my favorite place, and we're going to dig a little bit into this and some of the history of nonprofits, because most people, they think of a nonprofit organization as different than an organization. As there's there's organizations that are not nonprofits. And while it's true, there really aren't any official organizations that aren't nonprofits. So when I say nonprofit organization, just think organization, a group of people getting together. So a little bit of history. Nonprofits were one of the first special interest carve-outs in the tax code. Back in 1862, Abraham Lincoln commissioned the Bureau of Internal Revenue, and the income tax was created, as most people know, in 1913. Back in 1913, the IRS's mission statement was this: the purpose of the Internal Revenue Service is to collect the proper amount of tax revenue at the least cost. That makes sense. That's pretty simple. And in the 1913 Tariff Act, that's how we got the income tax. People were mad about tariff taxes and thought the tariff taxes were too high and advantaged certain corporations, so we created the income tax. And the government gave official corporation status to nonprofits. So there are essentially two types of corporation. You're a for-profit or you're a nonprofit, one or the other. Either you're a for-profit, which we usually call a company, or you're a nonprofit, which we usually call an organization. In 1913, every single nonprofit organization status that we have today was introduced back then. And in 1917, they authored the charitable deduction. Now, most people know of this as, they think of nonprofits as you get something off your taxes. Well, there's only one class of nonprofits that you get something off your taxes if you give to them, and that's 501c3s, named off the section of the code they're in. Well, that charitable exemption was put in there. And then in 1934, which because I'm crazy, I spent about 2 nights in a row reading the 1933 and 34 congressional record, trying to figure out why on earth they banned lobbying for organizations. And essentially, then they banned lobbying for certain types of organizations, but essentially there were 3 things. They were worried about Soviet propaganda, they were worried about Nazi propaganda, and prohibition had just been repealed, and they were very, very angry about that. And a nonprofit had led that charge. So later, in 1954, now actually Trump has brought up the Johnson Amendment. Most people had no idea this existed before Trump. But the Johnson Amendment was introduced, and it actually wasn't introduced to silence churches. It had nothing to do with churches. Most churches, they didn't want to take a political stance because then they might lose membership. There were actually 2 groups, Facts Forum and the Restoring Constitutional Governance Coalition. And they had been very against Lyndon Johnson's Senate candidacy. And they were 501c3s. And Mr. Johnson thought that the easiest way to shut them up, since he couldn't get the IRS to investigate them, the easiest way to shut them up would be to actually amend the law and change the law so that C3s could no longer endorse or have anything to do with any type of candidate whatsoever. Now, like I said, almost every organization, if they want to become official, will eventually organize as a nonprofit. You can't get a bank account if you don't have a nonprofit. You can't even protest at state houses if you don't have a nonprofit. You're basically, in order to be official, you have to be a nonprofit. Now, in this history, the IRS was given an extraordinary power that almost no government agency is ever afforded: the facts and circumstances test. What the facts and circumstances test is the IRS is trying to determine how much politics you participated in. As certain organizations, you can only participate in so much politics or so much electioneering. Well, the facts and circumstances test is essential, and I'm listing it from the federal regulations here, But the facts and circumstances test, we were looking for statutory authority for this, and there really isn't any. There really isn't any statutory authority or direction on how to guide this facts and circumstances test. So essentially, the IRS gets to look at your organization and arbitrarily decide whether or not you violated the law. There is no guidance whatsoever. The IRS just goes, did they or did they not? We feel like they did, or we feel like they didn't. And this facts and circumstances test doesn't exist in almost any other government agency. If the EPA shows up at your corporation and they say you've been violating the pollution laws, they can't look at the smokestack and go, I see smoke coming out of there. That's probably pollution, and then fine you for it. No other government agency has the level of discretion that the IRS has with the facts and circumstances test. So what has the IRS done with this power? Most people think that IRS targeting started in the Obama administration or started in the Bush administration. Well, no, absolutely not. In 1923, Calvin Coolidge's Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, targeted Senator James Couzens from Michigan. Had the IRS investigate him, did several years of audits, and then FDR used the IRS to target newspapers, including William Randolph Hearst's newspaper, political opponents, and to used it to get back at Mellon, actually, who used it prior. In 1961, JFK launched the Ideological Organizations Project. Is anyone here familiar with the IOP? Nice. So the Ideological Organizations Project was essentially, JFK wanted this idea of organizations that don't actually have an ideology. So they're not actually pushing for anything. They just want to educate on every single area, and they don't really care about anything, especially if they had an ideology opposed to his. So in this Ideological Organizations Project, organizations like AEI, or the American Enterprise Institute, and like the Foundation for Economic Education, or FEE, were actually targeted by the JFK administration. Nixon handed a handed a stamped envelope with 200 Democratic opponents to the IRS, and the IRS commissioner refused to use the IRS to target his political opponents. Nixon used basically every other administration instead. In 1989, the IRS refused to approve any groups that taught evolution. Agree with it or disagree with it, the fact that you have a different teaching than someone else shouldn't be grounds for being targeted. 1995, Heritage Foundation and 20 other conservative groups are targeted. I didn't include it in here. Under the Bush administration, the NAACP was targeted, as was Jeff's organization, the Fire Coalition, actually. And in 2010, we had the targeting of Tea Party groups. About every 10 or 15 years, the IRS gets called on the carpet for targeting organizations. And the fix proposed is not to remove the IRS from politics. No, it's to, we're going to more stringent controls. We're going to reorganize and reshuffle the board, and we're going to somehow make these accountants figure out how an organization is engaging politically, which I find just to be a ludicrous idea. So the 2010 targeting, most people don't know the extent of this. It was one of the worst instances of targeting, because not only did it happen during election time and during an election season, but over 400 groups were targeted. This is not 10, this is not 20, this is not 30, this is not 100. 400 to 500 groups were targeted. And people have mentioned liberal organizations were targeted too. Well, there is an excellent book by Kim Strassel, who is on the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. She just released a book called The Intimidation Game. It's all about the entire targeting scandal and how it actually worked and what actually happened. And the BOLO that the IRS used, the Be on the Lookout report, looking out for certain words that the IRS used, the spreadsheet that had the liberal words on it wasn't actually used in any of their investigations. So the IRS was used for purely political purposes to target organizations. In fact, Lois Lerner, who is a name pretty much everybody knows now, Lois Lerner used to work at the FEC, or the Federal Election Commission. So she brought the FEC into the IRS. And while we don't have any proof, because hard drives, did you know hard drives magically crash? And not only do they crash, but at once, like 4 of them crash at once. Well, since hard drives magically crash and emails magically get deleted, Hillary, the targeting, we really can't prove whether or not the administration directly ordered the IRS to do it, but he didn't need to. He was on the stump month after month after month after month saying the IRS needs to do something about these 501c4s. The IRS needs to do something about these 501c4s. He didn't need to go out and actually say it. Now, what is subjected to intense questioning? So some of the questions that we've been in touch with several of these Tea Party groups, and some of the questions were absolutely absurd. Questions like, what kind of books are you and your members reading? Questions like, can you provide the number of hours that each of your volunteers puts in and exactly what those volunteers are doing? Forget political targeting, that's almost impossible to calculate. There were questions like a lady in California got a question that was, what are the names of your board members? Which the IRS should already know because they submitted an application. But anyway, what are the names of your board members? What are the names of the family members of your board members? And do your board members plan on running for office, or do their family members plan on running for office? These are some of the questions that these groups would get sent. And some of the groups, because people fear the IRS so much, some of the groups would send them 10,000 pages of documents. The IRS asked for donor lists in particular for these groups. I know one lady who she gave the IRS back-end access to her website. And there was just this fear that, well, what are you going to do? It's the IRS. Nobody can fight the IRS. And they were held back from their official status. And a lot of people don't think that's that big deal. But like I said, bank account, we're protected from liability. If you want to be an official organization, you generally need to file with the IRS for your status. And so we get to what the IRS actually did about it. What was their response to this? Well, the response to this was predicted in a June 2013 memo from Acting Commissioner Daniel Werfel. He says the lack of clarity, talking about the law, did not cause the inappropriate screening and poor managerial oversight noted in the TIGTA report, nor does it excuse them. But we do believe it played a role in the lengthy delays in at least some of the determinations associated with these cases. So the IRS says the law isn't clear enough. Now, if the IRS just said the law isn't clear enough, Congress go fix it, it wouldn't be as big of a deal. But the IRS took it upon themselves to go fix this law. And that's how we ended up with this regulation. Now, because I don't like to memorize the number of the regulation, we've nicknamed this the IRS muzzle rule for how it muzzles the speech of people organized in groups. It was introduced in November 2013. The idea was to draw a bright line. Here's what you can and here's what you can't do as a nonprofit. At the top of the IRS's priority list, they said, Commissioner testified in March that this is one of their number one priorities. They want to get these rules passed. They want to apply them to C3s, C4s, C5s, C6s, C7s, 527s, and the entire spectrum of organizations. Redefines intervening in a political campaign to candidate-related political activity. So this is a classic trick in law, that they'll take something that's defined in law that they can't get around, which is intervening in a political campaign, and they'll redefine it as, oh, it's just related to the campaign in some way. So what was this bright line? The promotion of social welfare. Organizations under the particular category they were targeting at first, to spread it out everyone eventually, but organizations have to be exclusively dedicated to social welfare, advancing the welfare of society. Now, what they're saying is it does not include any of this. Conducting a voter registration drive. You cannot register voters as a nonprofit. Distribution of any material prepared by or on behalf of a candidate. So if Trump, Hillary, whoever, releases a statement, and you publish that statement, whether to praise it or criticize it, without endorsing that candidate, it's still banned under this rule. Preparation or distribution of a voter guide. How do most voters vote? An organization highlights an issue that they care about, and they go to the polls caring about that particular issue. Most of them, it's the parties. Some of them, it's nonprofit organizations. So if you can't produce a voter guide that refers to one or more of the clearly identified candidates, which we'll get into in a second, you're having a hard time informing the general populace. Hosting or conducting an event at which one of the candidates in such election appears as part of the program. How would this affect candidate debates? A lot of candidate debates are hosted by nonprofit organizations because the party doesn't want to host the Republican Party doesn't want to host a Democrat and vice versa. So a nonprofit organization is going to host this debate. Well, if you're an incumbent, you don't want to debate the new guy. You don't want anybody to learn about the new guy. So you love this rule. So let's say you're not taken aback by any of that, and you think that people generally shouldn't be able to do that anyway. Well, let's look at how the IRS pulls another legislative trick. Related definitions. The following terms are defined for purposes of this paragraph only. Okay? So these words do not mean what you think they mean, but they only mean what the IRS says they mean, and only for this paragraph. So they redefine 3 terms. Candidate means an individual who publicly offers himself or is proposed by another for selection, nomination, election, or appointment, not just to federal, but to state or local public office, or office in a political organization, whatever that means, or to be a presidential, vice president elector, whether or not such individual is ultimately elected. So what could candidate mean under this? Anyone running for any office you would be banned as an organization from talking about anyone running for any office. If you as an organization did not know that somebody you gave an award to was running for dog catcher in Alaska, and you talked about that person on your website, you could also be in violation of your nonprofit status. Anyone running for precinct chair of a Republican or Democratic Party, which are political organizations. Well, when you run for precinct chair, you don't necessarily file with the national voter databases that organizations use to figure out who's running. So you as an organization may not even know that someone on your website is running somewhere else, and you're still in violation of your nonprofit status. I don't know who Pat Paulson is. Jeff, did you put that in here?
David Rivers and Elder. Remember Pat Paulson? That was a perennial Pat Paulson for president. Whether he was a serious candidate or not, the mere fact that he said he's running for president, if somebody just putting that on their website as a joke, that's enough to put you in violation. To suggest somebody would be a good candidate, that in itself is enough.
And what show was he on? Pat Paulson? Laughing. Yeah. That's right.
And Mother's Brother, he got around.
Snoop Dogg actually said he would run for president. I think his campaign platform was he would ban big shoes. Anyone who wore big shoes. So, again, anyone proposed by anyone else to run for office. I could point at one of you in this room, and I could say, you're a great candidate for office, Seville. And then, all of a sudden, I can't talk about her anymore, neither can you. Sorry, Seville. Clearly identified. So this is where it gets fun. To me, clearly identified means clearly identified, that you know exactly who they're talking about. But to the IRS, clearly identified means mentioning their name, a photograph or drawing of the candidate. The identity of the candidate is apparent by reference. So if someone can infer that, oh yeah, you probably meant that person, then you're in violation. Such as use of the candidate's recorded voice. So if you have someone in your organization does a radio ad for you, and later on they run for office, well, you're still using their recorded voice in your radio ad. So, sorry, it sucks to be you. Terms such as, you can't even just say their name, terms such as the mayor, your congressman, the incumbent, the Democratic nominee, or the Republican candidate for county supervisor. In addition, a candidate may be clearly identified by reference to an issue or a characteristic used to distinguish that candidate from other candidates. Essentially, what the IRS is attempting to do here is prevent you from even accidentally affecting the election in any way, shape, or form. They're putting this bright line to keep politicians from getting criticized. I mean, at the end of the day, you can't criticize someone if you can't mention their name, and you can't even make a vague reference to what they're doing or who they are. An election, unlike most federal law, now covers federal, state, and local office. So when you look at this rule, here's the kicker. So the rule says 30 or 60 days. 30 days before a primary, or 60 days before a general election. The IRS puts this blackout period for 90 days, a year roughly for federal. The Treasury Department and the IRS intend that content previously posted by an organization on its website that clearly identifies a candidate and remains on the website during the specified election period will be treated as candidate-related political activity. So long story short, the time limit doesn't matter. You can't do this, you could never do this, period, end of story. This is what happens when we give the IRS the authority over an area that they have no business in. And let's talk about the definition of the bright line of speech for a second. What speech isn't political? This is the question the IRS is trying to answer. What speech is not political? Well, last I heard, bathrooms are political now. If you talk about the wrong kind of food in the right kind of company, that's political. So how can you separate any speech from political speech? And furthermore, how can you separate political speech from influencing an election? If you say, I'm for gun rights, you are implicitly saying, vote for the person who isn't against gun rights, or vote for the person who's for gun rights. These are inexplicably tied to each other. You cannot define, it's like defining hate speech. People know how hard the government has tried to define hate speech. Well, what is hate speech? Well, how is it different than any regular speech? It depends on someone's interpretation of that. So we cannot let the IRS interpret what the line of our free speech is. And yet, Congress has actually put us in an interesting position. Remember how earlier I said that the IRS created the first ever special interest exemption with nonprofits in the tax code in 1913? Well, they did. And if you don't want everyone to be a nonprofit all the time, you have to set some sort of limits on what a nonprofit can or can't do in their speech. That's the way Congress has set it up. Unless everyone wants to be a nonprofit and no one pays taxes. You could do that. But most people would only be comfortable with setting some sort of line for what that group can or cannot do. I think the IRS's definition of this bright line, that you can talk about the law maybe, as long as it's not related to a candidate, but can't mention the person who introduced it, and they can't like your issue. If Senator Rand Paul comes out and says, man, your issue is really good, then all of a sudden you can't talk about it anymore. You can talk about the law, but not those who voted for or against it, and you can talk about the issue, but you can't hold anyone accountable for doing something about it. And to provide a little bit of background on nonprofits, this is actually Lester M. Solomon, Johns Hopkins University. He's been studying nonprofits for 20, 30 years, and he said virtually all of America's major social movements, whether civil rights, environmental, consumer, women's, or conservative, have had their roots in the nonprofit sector. Why? Well, here's some of the groups. National American Women's Suffrage Association. They got women's suffrage. Association Against the Prohibition Amendment. They successfully repealed prohibition. NAACP successfully advanced civil rights. NRA. Sunlight Foundation, which introduced and passed our sunshine laws so that we know what our representatives are and aren't voting on. Patriot Coalition, Tax Revolution Institute, your organization. This is the community of nonprofits, people attempting to do something good. And yet, nonprofits are now caught in this crossfire. Who knows the term Citizens United? Who knows it has nothing to do with nonprofits? A couple of you, okay. Citizens United has to do with for-profit corporations and whether or not they could donate enough. But politicians found a really easy excuse to go after the nonprofit sector because that's who's keeping them accountable. And so nonprofits have been caught up in a lot of hate, that nonprofits shouldn't be involved in politics. People shouldn't be able to speak out about issues. People shouldn't be able to say who you can or who you should and shouldn't vote for. People shouldn't be able to do any of this. And yet, when you look at some of the facts on nonprofits, only 11 of them spent over $1 million on elections. You know how many nonprofits there are? There are 1.1 million 501c3s and there are 80,000 501c4s. Only 11 of them spent over $1 million on our elections, which is 1/10 of what Americans spend on fireworks. So we spend more on the 4th of July than we do in our elections through nonprofits. And they can't give money directly to candidates. So why would a politician in Congress not want to stop this? Why are our meetings on the Hill, we walk out of those meetings with nothing more than fire in our belly? Why is that?
Because they're all incumbents.
Because
they're already elected, they're being incumbent.
That's one reason. What's another reason?
Follow the money.
Where's the money coming from? Anyone?
Supporters who want influence.
Supporters who want influence, doing it through?
For-profit businesses.
Not quite.
Lobby, oh, no, wait.
Nope.
Special interest groups.
Super PACs. Super PACs in 2012, by this time this year, had spent $330 million on the election. Super PACs by this time this year spent $660 million on the elections. 9% of election spending is C4s, is citizens groups, is advocacy groups, is nonprofits. The rest is super PACs. So why do the politicians in Washington not want to stop this rule? Well, if you eliminate nonprofits from the political process, you eliminate your competition. Now it's just super PACs. Now it's just for-profit corporations. Now it's just the lobbyists. Now it's just the big money. So what has Congress done? Well, Congress has a perpetual pantry full of cans. And anytime they hear from a citizen on an issue, they take the can and they kick it down the road. And what Congress did in 2015 was they introduced this section and said none of the funds made available in this or any other act may be used by the Department of Treasury, including the IRS, to revise any regulation related to an organization, whether an organization is operated exclusively for the promotion of social welfare. Now this is interesting because the law says you have to exclusively be dedicated to social welfare, period, end of story. The IRS reinterpreted that law to say you only have to be primarily dedicated to social welfare. And so a lot of the hate the nonprofit groups get is from a couple of organizations interpreting that primarily to mean 51%, and the other 49% they spending money on ads for candidates. So the IRS kind of created this dark money debacle, and the IRS actually used that primarily versus exclusively as one of the excuses for why they targeted the Tea Party nonprofits. Well, they created that. They created that differential. And Congress is worried now because a lot of the groups that are C4s and are abusing that advantage in the system are conservative or Republican groups. And so they're worried if the IRS starts following the law now that they might lose some of those groups who are abusing the system. So they're actually, instead of just banning that rule, which they put at the end there, they're actually going after, IRS cannot make any rules whatsoever related to C4s. Blanket ban, we're not going to give you any funding, period, end of story. Well, the problem with that is, number one, it's in a funding bill, which means it expires at the end of the year every year. This year, it expires at the end of this month, September 30th. If Congress does not pass a rider, the IRS starts passing that rule. And considering the fact that we can't just bang on the IRS's door and make them not pass the rule, we need to get Congress to take action on this. But by passing the rider, they're kicking the can down the road to a point where, number one, it's not their fault. Number two, it's unsustainable. If you are Congress and you are saying you can't, as the IRS, do any rules whatsoever on nonprofit organizations or on C4 organizations, then you're essentially prohibiting the IRS from making even small changes to the enforcement and to what they're doing. Eventually, the IRS is going to want to do something with these organizations, whether it's this rule or whether it's something as simple as Form A is now Form B. The IRS makes rules all the time on nonprofits. Eventually, someone's going to come up with an idea they should do that. More importantly, it prevents the IRS from following the law as it's written is exclusively and makes it primarily. Now, and the final thing is, this is already chilling free speech. If you're a smart nonprofit attorney and you're talking to your organization, what you're telling them is Congress will eventually let the IRS do this. They're only kicking the can down the road. They'll eventually not kick the can down the road, and they'll let the IRS go through with this rule. So you need to stop doing any of the activities banned in that rule so you don't lose your nonprofit status. Any smart attorney is doing that right now. So this kicking the can down the road approach is already chilling free speech. It's already chilling the speech of nonprofit organizations. So what is the solution? You put the green and orange in there. I like that. So what is the solution? The solution is not to have accountants make decisions that judges should be making. The person who should decide whether or not you lose your nonprofit status because you engage too much in politics is a judge where you're innocent until proven guilty, and they have to bring the evidence in front of the court to say, you're wrong, here's the end of the story. It should not be to accountants who really have no idea how politics works in an organization. And people on both sides of this issue agree. Cleta Mitchell, anybody know who Cleta Mitchell is? Yeah. Several of you. Cleta Mitchell is a Tea Party attorney. She represented a lot of the Tea Party groups who were targeted by the IRS, and she said, I'm very glad that Congress blocked the development and issuance of more speech suppression regulations for citizens groups. And my only wish is that they had made it permanent. And it said the IRS can never promulgate or issue regulations governing citizen political activity and speech. It is outrageous overreach by the IRS to even contemplate such regulations. And Gregory L. Colvin, whose team came up with the rule at the Bright Lines Project. Conservatives tend to want the line drawn at express advocacy, which would allow much more nonprofit speech tilted for or against candidates and parties than liberals would prefer. But both sides would be better with a clear IRS interpretation, whatever that may be. A key function of our law, except for tax law apparently, is that it should be clear. You as the citizen should be able to understand the law. Remember, the framers wrote the Constitution so the common man could read it and understand it. A key function of law is it should be clear. And once it's clear, nonprofit organizations are going to know at what point the IRS might come after them. So you're going to see a lot more nonprofits be willing to talk about issues that are considered political. We're going to see more citizen engagement if they know where the line is. So we've proposed a little bit of a line in the Free Speech Protection Act. Free Speech Protection Act does three things. Number one, it explicitly defines the line as express advocacy, i.e. you either endorse the candidate or you say don't vote for that candidate. That's the only thing that can get the IRS to come after you, is explicit advocacy, which the Supreme Court has clearly defined. And actually, each of you has a copy of the FSPA in your documents on your table. Number two, we replace the facts and circumstances test, which is a ridiculous test, with innocent until proven guilty. Essentially, you as the citizen have a presumption of innocence if you're using speech that the IRS has to bring the highest standard, which is clear and convincing evidence that you violated express advocacy provisions, and prohibits any future rules from the IRS on organizations speaking out outside of express advocacy, essentially for the end of time. This is a permanent clearing up of what nonprofits can and what nonprofits can't do, which takes it to the very closest to constitutional protections we can get, which is you can't endorse, you can't say vote for, you can't say vote against. Other than that, you're completely good to go. Everything else you say is fine. That's what the Free Speech Protection Act does. It also puts that in the Federal Election Commission's hands instead of the IRS's, so that the IRS generally isn't involved with the process whatsoever. So what we want to do is very simple. And I think that it really should resonate with people on the left, with people on the right, with people across the political spectrum, is we want to get the IRS out of politics. The IRS does not belong in our political speech. They do not belong in our politics.
Amendment that would have covered all of this.
I've heard of it. The only problem legislatively with the First Amendment is, again, going back to the tax code, is because Congress carved out this special provision where you're tax exempt, Congress gave itself the authority to tell tax exempt groups what to do. Because those groups are getting essentially a benefit. They view it as a subsidy. That they're getting a subsidy from Congress, more or less.
But isn't this also affecting individuals, not just nonprofits?
And any individual who is associated with or involved with a nonprofit, if it could be viewed that their speech is speaking on behalf of that organization, absolutely. As a nonprofit, if you volunteer for that nonprofit and you say something that the IRS goes, well, that's probably what that nonprofit would have said.
And Congress is cooperating 100% with you all, right?
Ha! Ha! If that...
Wait a minute. Republicans are in Congress, right? They're in charge.
That's what they keep telling us.
And they're not cooperating. They don't want us to have this free speech. They're incumbents.
Absolutely not.
They're worrisome.
Absolutely. And it's not only worrisome to conservatives, it's also worrisome to many liberals. And that's represented by the diversity of our coalition. Our coalition, just was 2 weeks ago, we put out a press release saying we had 24 members on our coalition. I think we have about 46 now. And various members of the coalition include some of the Tea Parties that she mentioned, but they also include groups like Move to Amend. They're a liberal group attempting to amend the Constitution. They support a con, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet they're still against this rule. Fight for the Future is a liberal group that fought for internet freedom back in 2010, 2011, tried to keep them, successfully kept Congress from censoring the internet. They're on board our coalition. The Coffee Party, a liberal alternative to the Tea Party, they're on board our coalition. We have a coalition of groups from the right and from the left saying you cannot, as Congress, allow the IRS to tamp down on citizen engagement. And we really need to get the IRS just completely out of politics, period. So what can you do? What you can do is simple. Number one, if you are part of an organization, you're a member of an organization, you're a donor to an organization, let them know about this rule and tell them to get on board the First Amendment Alliance. In a month, we have 40 organizations. When we stop going to Congress and stop sitting on their doorstep and we start going to the people instead over the next several months and over the rest of this year, we're going to get many more organizations than that. If you are a private citizen, contact your congressman and tell them to support the Free Speech Protection Act. We don't need a Congress that continually kicks the can down the road and pretends like they're doing something and says they're totally doing something, we're totally protecting your rights, while continuing to make it the onus of other congressmen to do the real work. That's what we don't need. So contact your congressman and tell them to support the Free Speech Protection Act. This is a timer taken from our website a little bit earlier. This is when Congress's protections expire. 22 days, 13 hours, and now it's about maybe 12 hours and 10 minutes at this point. We have to get Congress to pass legislation before September 30th to protect free speech from the IRS. What they'll probably do is they'll pass the rider. That'll give us another year. We'll work on it. But what Congress needs to do to protect nonprofit organizations and really protect what is a founding principle of our government, which is citizens should be engaged. Citizens should have the ability to know what's going on, and citizens should have the ability to speak their mind, even if they're in a group of people. One thing that House Democrat Javier Becerra, who is pushing hard to give the IRS this kind of power, doesn't understand, besides numbers. He quoted the wrong numbers in his speech on the floor. But besides numbers, one of the things he doesn't understand is that nonprofit organizations comprise citizens. They comprise citizen engagement in government. And if we reduce citizen engagement in government in this country, the further we reduce it, the closer we get to becoming what we fought to free ourselves from. We fought to free ourselves from a monarchy. We fought to free ourselves from dictatorships. We fought dictatorships around the world. And if you reduce the citizens' ability to know what's going on in their government, you reduce the citizens' ability to speak out. What a liberal does not understand, like Becerra does not understand, is that the NAACP, which is not viewed very favorably by conservatives today, but was key to the civil rights movement, organized the Montgomery bus boycott. After they organized the Montgomery bus boycott, the governor hauled them into court using the attorney general and wanted their donor list. We want to know exactly who's donating to you, which would have absolutely led to lynchings. And so they fought it. They fought it in Alabama. They fought it all the way up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said, no, Alabama, the right to association includes the right to get together in groups and to be private in that association. They brought it back down to Alabama. Alabama fought them again. They went all the way back up to the Supreme Court. They did this 5 times in the civil rights movement to protect the identities of their donors, to protect the right to join in whatever organization you want to be involved in, to push whatever issue you want to push as a fundamental right in the United States. And that is something the IRS is attempting to take away, and Congress is doing nothing to stop them. That's what I'm here to tell you. Our First Amendment Alliance, firstaa.org, we are the Tax Revolution Institute, working to protect Americans from the IRS, reform the IRS, and create a better tax collecting agency that really only collects taxes, which would be a crazy concept, but something we want to do. Again, thank you very much for having me, opening up for questions.